The shot echoed across the valley like a death sentence, but Silas Ward wasn't aiming at what he hit. He stood frozen, his rifle still smoking in his trembling hands, staring at the small figure crumpled behind the boulder. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, wearing clothes that didn't belong to any ranch around these parts. Apache. What in God's name was an Apache child doing this far from tribal lands? And why was he alone, moving like a shadow between the rocks at dawn? Silas had been tracking what he thought was a wounded deer for 3 long hours. The blood trail led him here, to this lonely cluster of red stones where the morning mist still clung like ghostly fingers. He'd seen a flicker of movement, raised his rifle, and fired at what should have been his prey. Instead, he'd shot a boy. The child wasn't moving. Blood was pooling beneath his small frame, a dark stain against the pale dirt. But as Silas crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs, he saw something else, something that made no sense at all. The boy's hands were bound tight with rope, and the raw, chafed marks on his wrists looked days, maybe even weeks, old. Someone had been holding this child captive. But who? And why was he out here in the middle of nowhere, tied up and running for his life? Silas knelt beside the motionless figure, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. The boy's breathing was shallow, a tiny little flutter, but it was steady. He was alive. Barely. That's when he heard them. Hoofbeats, approaching fast from the east. Multiple riders moving with a purpose that turned his blood to ice. They were heading straight for this place. In that terrifying moment, the boy's eyes fluttered open. Just for a second. They met Silas's gaze with a look of pure, animal terror. His chapped lips moved, forming a single, desperate word in broken English. Hide. Then his eyes rolled back into his head, and he went limp again. The hoofbeats were getting closer, pounding like a war drum. Silas could hear voices now, rough, angry voices calling out words he couldn't quite understand, but the tone was unmistakable. They were hunting. They were hunting for this boy. Whatever nightmare had brought this Apache child into this remote valley, bleeding and bound, it wasn't over. And now Silas was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. But what he decided to do in the next 10 seconds would shock everyone, especially the boy's people when they came looking for answers. The decision came to Silas in that split second before the riders crested the hill. He couldn't leave the boy. He couldn't let them find him like this, wounded and defenseless. Without a second thought, Silas scooped the child into his arms, surprised by how light he felt, like a bundle of sticks. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, blood seeping through his torn shirt from where the bullet had grazed his side. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it needed attention, and it needed it fast. The voices grew louder, harsher, more demanding. Through the thinning morning mist, Silas caught sight of 3 men on horseback, their faces weathered and cruel, the kind of faces that promised violence. These weren't Apache. Their clothes, their saddles, their rifles. They were drifters, the kind who made their living on the wrong side of the law. "Where'd that little rat go?" one of them shouted, his voice echoing across the rocks. "He can't have gone far with them ropes on." Silas pressed himself tight against the cold stone of the boulder, holding his breath, trying to make himself invisible. The boy in his arms stirred weakly, letting out a soft, pitiful moan that seemed as loud as a thunderclap in the morning stillness. One of the horses snorted, its rider pulling up short, his head cocked. "You hear something?" he asked his companions. The leader just spat on the ground. "Just keep looking. Boss ain't gonna be happy if we come back empty-handed again." The riders spread out, their horses' hooves clicking and scraping against the stone as they began a systematic search. Silas could hear them getting closer and closer. He knew his hiding spot wouldn't last. The boy needed a doctor, and these men clearly meant him harm. That's when he made the choice that would change everything. Instead of staying hidden, praying they wouldn't find him, Silas stood up. He stood up, still carrying the unconscious boy, and walked directly toward his own horse, tied near the creek bed. He moved with a calm purpose, as if he belonged there, as if carrying a wounded, unconscious Apache boy was the most natural thing in the world. "Hey!" one of the riders called out, spotting him. "You there!" Silas turned slowly, calmly, shifting the boy's weight in his arms. "Morning," he said, his voice miraculously steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. The three men rode over, their horses circling him like vultures. The leader was a grizzled man with a nasty scar running down his left cheek from his eye to his jaw. He looked Silas up and down, his gaze lingering on the boy. "You seen a boy come through here? Apache kid, 'bout this tall?" He held a grimy hand at chest height. "Can't say I have," Silas replied, looking the man straight in the eye, not backing down. "Been huntin' since dawn." He then gestured to the child in his arms, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Only thing I've seen is this." The scarred man's eyes narrowed, studying the unconscious child. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said slowly. "That's him. That's our boy." "Your boy?" Silas asked, his grip tightening protectively around the child, a cold dread washing over him. "Belongs to us," another rider snarled, his hand inching toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "Hand him over." But Silas was already backing away, moving slowly toward his horse, his mind racing faster than it ever had before. These men had been holding this boy captive. That much was clear from their words, from the terror in the boy's eyes, from the raw rope marks on his wrists. Whatever they wanted him for, it wasn't good. "I don't think so," Silas said quietly, his voice low but firm. The scarred man's hand moved from his saddle horn to the pistol on his hip. "Son," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Silas knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. 3 hardened, cruel men against one young rancher with a single-shot rifle and a wounded boy in his arms. But sometimes, desperation can make a coward into a hero. And Silas Ward was no coward. "This boy's been shot," Silas said, his voice ringing out in the clear morning air, a statement of fact that was also a challenge. "He needs medical attention, not whatever you men had planned for him." The scarred leader let out a harsh, grating laugh, a sound like gravel scraping against metal. "What we got planned ain't your concern, boy. That little Apache is worth good money to the right people." Money. The word hit Silas like a physical blow. They weren't just holding the boy captive. They were selling him. The rope marks, the desperate escape, the terror in his eyes when he whispered that one word, "Hide." It all made a horrible, sickening kind of sense now. This wasn't just kidnapping. This was slavery. "Over my dead body," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with a resolve that surprised even himself. "That can be arranged," the second rider said, leveling his rifle, the dark hole of the barrel looking like a gateway to eternity. But Silas had one advantage they didn't expect. He knew this land. He knew it better than the back of his own hand. Every rock, every gully, every dry creek bed was carved into his memory from a lifetime of hunting and herding cattle. The creek just behind him led to a narrow, twisting canyon, a place that would force them to come at him single file. It was his only chance. "You boys might want to think this through," Silas said, still backing slowly, step by agonizing step, toward the water's edge. "This is Ward land you're on. My family's been here for 20 years. Neighbors tend to get real curious when strangers come calling with rifles drawn." It was a complete bluff. His closest neighbor was miles away, but it worked. The scarred man's ironclad confidence wavered, just for a second. The Ward name carried weight in these parts. Reputation was everything out here in the territories. "Don't matter whose land this is," the leader growled. but his voice had lost some of its sharp, brutal certainty. Business is business. Just then, the boy stirred in Silas's arms. His eyes fluttered open. He looked up at the face of his unlikely rescuer with a dazed confusion, then past him, at the three riders. A wave of pure fear washed over his young face, and he tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping whisper came out. "It's all right," Silas murmured to him, trying to keep his own voice from shaking. "You're safe now." But they weren't safe. Not yet. The riders were starting to spread out, trying to flank him, to cut off his path to the canyon. In moments, they'd have him surrounded with no escape. That's when Silas heard it. The sound he'd been bluffing about, the sound he'd been praying for. Hoofbeats, from the east, coming fast, multiple riders, and these ones, he recognized. Silas. The voice belonged to his neighbor, Marcus Holloway, and he wasn't alone. 3 riders topped the ridge, their rifles held ready, drawn by the sound of angry voices carrying across the valley. The odds had just changed. The scarred man cursed under his breath, a string of foul words that hung in the air. He saw his advantage evaporate in an instant. This had just gone from a simple recovery to a potential gunfight with local ranchers on their own land. "This ain't over," he snarled at Silas, his eyes burning with hatred. "That boy belongs to us." "Not anymore, he doesn't," Marcus called out from the ridge, his rifle trained squarely on the stranger's chest. The 3 men exchanged nervous glances, weighing their options. 3 against 3. But they were on foreign ground, facing armed neighbors who clearly knew each other well. It wasn't a fight they could win. "We'll be back for what's ours," the leader spat, wheeling his horse around with a violent jerk. As the strangers galloped away, disappearing back over the ridge, Silas felt the boy's small hand grip his shirt with surprising strength. He was conscious now, trying to tell him something, his lips forming words that barely made a sound. But what the child was trying to warn him about would prove to be far more dangerous than any 3 armed men. Back at the Ward Ranch, Silas's mother, Martha, took one look at the wounded boy in her son's arms and didn't ask a single question. She was a woman carved from the tough soil of the frontier, and she knew a crisis when she saw one. She simply pointed to the sturdy wooden kitchen table and began gathering supplies with a practiced efficiency. "Hot water, clean cloth, and the good whiskey," she ordered, her gentle but firm hands already examining the boy's wound. "The bullet just grazed him, thank the Lord. But it's deep. It needs a thorough cleaning." Marcus Holloway and his men had followed them back, their faces still grim, still wary of the strangers who might decide to return. "Silas," Marcus said quietly, pulling him aside while Martha worked. "You know what you've done here, don't you? Taking in an Apache boy? Folks ain't gonna understand." "I know exactly what I've done," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on his mother's steady hands as she tended to the child. "And I'd do it again in a heartbeat." But as Martha carefully cleaned the grime and dried blood from around the wound, her fingers brushed against something hard hidden beneath the boy's torn shirt, pressed against his skin. It was a small, worn leather pouch. She gently worked it free. Inside were 3 heavy gold coins and a single piece of folded paper. Silas carefully unfolded the document, his face growing pale, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury as he read the words written there. It was a bill of sale, a meticulously written document in perfect English, describing the boy, identified only as Apache male, approx 12 years, as property, sold to a man named Garrett Wells for the sum of $50. They weren't just holding him, Silas said, his voice tight, seething with a rage he had never felt before. They bought him. Someone sold this boy like he was livestock. Martha's hands stilled. She'd seen more than her share of cruelty in her 45 years on this harsh frontier. But this was different. This was a level of evil that defied understanding. This was a child, no older than her own nephew back east. The boy's eyes fluttered open, slowly focusing on the strange new faces around him. Then he saw the paper in Silas's hands. A look of sheer panic flooded his features. He tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "No, go back," he whispered in his broken English, his voice desperate. "Please, no, go back." "You're not going anywhere," Silas said firmly, his voice softening as he looked at the terrified child. "You're safe here, I promise." But the boy, whose name they would soon learn was Dakota, shook his head frantically, his dark eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the men who had been chasing him. "Not safe," he insisted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They come. Many men come for Dakota." "How many men?" Marcus asked, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that was now leaning against the wall. The boy held up both of his small hands, fingers splayed. Then he did it again. Then he held up 3 fingers. 23. The number hit the quiet kitchen like a blast of cold wind. 23? Martha breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Sweet mercy. What kind of operation are they running out there? Dakota struggled to explain, his limited English mixing with Apache words they couldn't possibly understand. But gradually, through gestures and simple, repeated phrases, a horrifying picture began to emerge. There was a camp. A hidden camp, nestled deep in the canyons, a 2-day ride north of their ranch. Children were kept there, dozens of them. Apache, Mexican, taken from their families, stolen from their homes, and sold to buyers who came from distant, unknown territories. "How long were you there?" Silas asked gently, kneeling beside the table. Dakota held up 7 fingers, then made a small, circular gesture in the air, a gesture for the moon. 7 months. For 7 months, this 12-year-old boy had been held captive in a living hell, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Marcus stood up abruptly, his face a grim mask. "We need to get word to the territorial marshal in Prescott. This is bigger than any of us can handle." But Dakota grabbed Silas's arm with a surprising, desperate strength. "No lawman," he said urgently, his eyes pleading. "Lawman help bad men. Lawman take money too." The corruption ran deeper than they could have ever imagined. If the boy was right, then going to the authorities wasn't just useless. It might be signing his death warrant. They could be sending him right back to the men who had bought him. "Then what do we do?" Martha asked, her voice trembling slightly, looking from her son to the terrified child on her table. Silas looked down at Dakota, and he saw not just a wounded, frightened child, but a survivor. A boy who had endured months of unimaginable horror and had still found the strength to escape. The boy had trusted him enough to speak, to reveal the terrible truth about his captors. "We take him home," Silas said quietly, a sudden, unshakable certainty settling in his heart. "Home?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "To his people," Silas clarified, "to his family." But what Silas didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that taking Dakota home would require him to do something no white man had ever attempted in these parts. It would require him to cross a line from which there was no return. The Apache territory began 20 miles north of the Ward Ranch. It wasn't marked by fences or posts, but by a fragile, unspoken understanding that had kept a tense peace in the region for the last 3 years. White settlers stayed south, the Apache stayed north, and the few, rare meetings between the two groups were handled through careful, cautious negotiation. Silas had never crossed that invisible line. No ward ever had. But as he prepared for the journey, loading supplies onto his sturdiest horse while Dakota rested inside, he knew he had no other choice. The boy needed to get home, and after 7 long months of captivity, he deserved to see his family again. "You're making a terrible mistake, Silas," Marcus warned him, his voice low and serious. "The Apache don't distinguish between good white men and bad ones. They'll see your face, and they'll assume you're one of the men who took that boy." Martha emerged from the house, her face etched with worry, but her hands were full. She carried a bundle of food and medical supplies. "The boy's fever broke this morning," she reported, her voice quiet but strong. "He's weak, but he's stable enough to travel." Just then, Dakota himself appeared in the doorway. He was moving slowly, but he was on his own 2 feet. Martha had found him some of her late husband's old clothes, cutting them down to fit his small frame. He looked almost like any other frontier boy now, except for the profound weariness in his dark eyes, a shadow that spoke of experiences no child should ever have to endure. "You don't have to come with me," Silas told him gently. "I can take you to your people. I can explain what happened." Dakota shook his head, a flicker of that same unshakable resolve in his eyes. "Dakota, go," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Must tell father. About other children." Other children. The words hit Silas like a punch to the gut. He had almost forgotten. In his focus on getting Dakota home, the larger horror had momentarily slipped his mind. There were more kids in that hidden camp. 22 other children, still trapped, still waiting to be sold. By bringing Dakota home, they weren't just returning a lost son. They might be able to organize a rescue. The ride north took them through terrain that grew more rugged and unforgiving with each passing mile. The familiar rolling hills of the ranch lands gave way to jagged rocks and steep, winding canyons. Dakota, despite his young age and his ordeal, proved to be an excellent guide. He pointed out safe paths and hidden water sources that Silas, for all his knowledge of this land, never would have found on his own. As they traveled, the boy began to open up, speaking in his halting English. His father, he explained, was a man named Nalish, a respected leader among his people. A leader who had been searching relentlessly for his son since the day he had disappeared. Dakota had been taken while hunting rabbits near the river, grabbed from behind by men who specialized in capturing children from isolated, vulnerable areas. "Why children?" Silas asked, though a part of him dreaded the answer. "Easier to break," Dakota said, with a chilling, matter-of-fact tone that no child should possess. "Easier to make forget family, sell far away, no one come looking." The casual, horrifying logic of it made Silas's stomach turn. This wasn't the first time these men had done this. This was a well-oiled machine, built on the suffering of children and the grief of their parents. By late afternoon, they had reached the edge of the Apache lands. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, more watchful. Dakota grew more alert, his head constantly scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of his people. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke from cooking fires rose into the vast blue sky, and Silas felt his nerves tighten into a hard, cold knot in his stomach. "They see us," Dakota said simply. Silas looked around, his eyes straining, but he saw nothing but rocks and sparse, hardy trees. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure emerging from behind a cluster of boulders, then another, from the shadows of a weathered pine. They appeared as if from nowhere, materializing out of the very landscape itself. Apache warriors, at least a dozen of them, surrounding their position with a practiced, deadly stealth. One of them stepped forward. He was a tall man, his hair streaked with gray, his face a road map of old scars that spoke of many battles. When he saw Dakota, his stern, hard expression cracked, and Silas heard him whisper the boy's name, a sound that was half prayer, half cry of disbelief. "Father!" Dakota called out, sliding down from the horse and running toward the man. The reunion was everything Silas had hoped for. A father embracing his lost son, tears of relief and joy streaming down his weathered face. But as Nalish looked up, over his son's shoulder, at the white man who had brought his boy home, Silas saw something in those dark, piercing eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't gratitude, it was suspicion. Pure, undiluted suspicion, and something else that looked dangerously like rage. The other warriors had their weapons ready, and in that moment, Silas realized he might have just made the biggest and last mistake of his life. Nailish spoke rapidly in Apache to his warriors, his voice sharp, carrying the unquestionable authority of a leader making critical decisions in a dangerous situation. Silas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were discussing what to do with him, and it didn't sound good. "Father, no," Dakota said suddenly, stepping between the warriors and Silas, placing his small body in front of the rancher. He spoke in English, making sure Silas understood. "This man saved Dakota. He is a good man." "White men took you," Nalish replied in a careful, measured English, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. "A white man brings you back. Why should I trust any of your people?" The logic was painful, but it was undeniable. From Nalish's perspective, white settlers had kidnapped his son and held him captive for 7 months. Now, another white man simply appears out of the wilderness, claiming to be a rescuer. It could easily be a trick, a trap. Silas slowly, carefully dismounted from his horse, keeping his hands open and visible, far away from his weapons. "I understand your suspicion," he said, his voice calm and even. "If someone took my boy, I'd feel the same way." "You have no boy," Nailish observed flatly. "No," Silas admitted. "But I have a mother who would die of a broken heart if I disappeared, just like you nearly died when Dakota was taken from you." Something flickered in the Apache leader's eyes. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps recognition. The recognition of the universal pain of a parent's love, a pain that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. Dakota pulled the folded, crumpled paper from his pocket. The bill of sale that had named him as property. A piece of paper that had condemned him to a life of slavery. He handed it to his father and began speaking rapidly in Apache, his small hands gesturing first toward Silas and then back toward the south, where the Slavers' camp lay hidden. As Nalish read the document, his expression darkened, the lines on his face deepening into a mask of pure fury. He looked at his son's healing wound, still visible beneath the borrowed shirt, and then back at Silas with a dawning new understanding. "My son says you shot him," Nailish said finally, his voice a low growl. "By accident." "I did," Silas admitted without hesitation. "I was hunting. I thought he was a deer. When I realized what I'd done, when I saw the ropes, I couldn't let those men take him back. They were chasing him. They said he belonged to them, said they'd paid good money for him." Nalnish crumpled the vile paper in his fist, raw rage building in his features. 23 children, he said, the words choked with grief and anger. "My son tells me there are 23 children stolen from their families. We have to stop them," Silas said, seizing the moment. "We?" Nalish's voice carried a sharp, cynical edge. "You'll need someone who knows their territory," Silas pressed on, his mind racing. "Someone they won't suspect. Someone they think is just another settler looking to do business." The Apache leader studied him for a long, silent moment. Around them, the warriors waited patiently for his decision. Their weapons were still ready, but they were no longer pointed directly at Silas. "Why would you risk this?" Nalish asked, the question cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "These are not your people's children." Silas thought about Dakota's small hand gripping his shirt in the back of the ranch house. He thought about the pure terror in the boy's eyes. He thought about the casual, cruel way those men had spoken about selling a child for money. "Any child in chains is my concern," he said simply. Dakota spoke again in Apache, his young voice earnest and persuasive. Whatever he was saying seemed to carry immense weight with his father. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nalish gave a slow, deliberate nod. My son says you cared for his wound, as if he were your own family, he said, his eyes locking with Silas's. He says you fed him from your own table and risked your own life to bring him home. He paused, letting the words hang in the tense air. This is not the action of an enemy. Then you'll trust me? Silas asked, a sliver of hope rising in his chest. I will use you, Nailish corrected him, his voice still hard. There is a difference. But as he spoke, Silas saw something else in the Apache leader's eyes, something that hadn't been there before. It was a glimmer of respect. Tell me about this camp, Nailish said, his focus shifting entirely to the mission ahead. Tell me everything my son remembers, and then we will plan how to bring our children home. But what neither of them knew, what none of them could have possibly known, was that their entire conversation was being watched. From a distant sun-baked ridge, a man lay flat on his stomach, a brass spyglass pressed to his eye. He was one of Garrett Wells's men, a scout sent to track the escaped merchandise, and he had just found him. Through the lens, he studied the unlikely meeting between the formidable Apache leader and the young, determined rancher, a knot of confusion and opportunity tightening in his gut. Below them, Silas was drawing a crude map in the dirt with a stick, marking locations as Dakota described the hidden camp. The boy's memory was remarkably, chillingly detailed. He pointed out guard positions, the layout of the makeshift prison where the children were kept, and the times of day when security was at its lightest. 23 children, Nailish repeated, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. Apache, Mexican, even some white children, taken from isolated homesteads. The buyers come from all over, Dakota added, his voice small but clear. East, west, north. They take children far away, where nobody know them, where nobody can find them. Silas felt sick to his stomach, thinking about all those families scattered across the territories, searching desperately for their vanished sons and daughters, never knowing the true horror of what had happened to them, never knowing their children were being sold like cattle. How many guards? Nailish asked, his focus sharp and practical. 8 men stay at camp, always, Dakota said. More come when the buyers arrive. The Apache leader studied the crude map, his mind already working through the tactical possibilities. 8 men. It was a formidable number, but not an impossible one for his warriors. No, Silas said quickly, shaking his head. If Apache warriors attack the camp head-on, they'll kill the children before they'd ever surrender them. We need a different approach, a smarter one. Nailish's eyes narrowed. What do you suggest, white man? I go in first. Alone, Silas said, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke the words. I'll scout the actual layout, confirm the number of guards, confirm the children are there. Then, we coordinate a rescue that saves lives instead of ending them. It is too dangerous, Nailish said flatly. I'm the only one who can do it, Silas insisted. I can get close without raising suspicion. Those men who chased Dakota, they've seen my face now. They think I'm just some dumb rancher who got mixed up in their business by accident. They won't expect me to come looking for them. It was a risky plan, but it was a reasonable one. Still, Nailish clearly didn't like the idea of putting the fate of his son's rescue and the rescue of all the other children in the hands of a settler he barely knew. It was Dakota who spoke up. Father, he said, his voice firm. Silas speaks the truth. The guards know that white men sometimes come to the camp to buy children. The idea made Silas's skin crawl, but he knew in an instant that it was brilliant. He wouldn't go in as a nosy rancher. He would go in posing as a potential customer, a man looking to buy. He could get inside the camp, see everything, and report back on the exact situation without anyone suspecting a thing. And if they discover your deception? Nailish asked, his voice grim. Then I'm dead, Silas said, his own voice equally grim. And you'll know for sure that you can never trust another white man again. On the distant ridge, the watcher had seen enough. He carefully packed away his spyglass, scrambled back to his hidden horse, and began riding hard and fast back toward the hidden camp. He carried news that would change everything. Back at the meeting site, Nalish was already organizing his warriors, preparing them for the rescue operation. But as they planned, their focus entirely on the map in the dirt, none of them noticed the small cloud of dust rising in the far distance. A cloud of dust kicked up by a single rider, pushing his horse to its absolute limits. "We move at dawn," Nalish decided, his voice firm. "Silas, you will enter the camp as planned. If you succeed in your scouting, we will strike at sunset when the fading light favors our approach." "And if I don't succeed?" Silas asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Then we attack anyway," Nalish said, his face like stone. "And we pray that the children survive." It wasn't much of a backup plan, but it was better than doing nothing. It was better than leaving 22 children in the hands of slave traders. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Silas prepared for what might very well be his last night on Earth. He'd gone from accidentally shooting an Apache boy in the morning to planning a joint rescue operation with the boy's warrior father by evening. It was a turn of events so surreal, he could hardly believe it himself. But 20 miles away, in a hidden canyon, Garrett Wells was reading a hastily scrawled message delivered by a dust-covered rider. And as he read, a slow, cold smile spread across his thin lips. The escaped boy hadn't just been found. He had led them straight to an Apache war party. And now, Garrett Wells had leverage he had never, in his wildest dreams, expected to have. The rescue mission was about to become a trap. At dawn, Silas rode alone toward the hidden camp. He had a bag of heavy silver coins in his saddlebags and a carefully rehearsed story in his mind. He was a wealthy rancher, looking to buy young, cheap workers for his expanding operation. It was a common enough practice in the territories, though it usually involved adults, not children. It was a disgusting lie, but it was a believable one. The camp was just as Dakota had described it, nestled in a narrow canyon, hidden from casual view, but easily defended from a frontal assault. As Silas approached the narrow entrance, 2 guards materialized from the shadows of the rocks, their rifles held at the ready. "State your business," one of them demanded, his voice rough. "Heard you boys might have some young workers for sale," Silas said, doing his best to keep his voice casual and steady, to hide the frantic beating of his heart. "Name's Ward. I run cattle south of here." The guards exchanged a long, meaningful glance. One of them disappeared back into the camp, while the other kept his rifle trained on Silas. Minutes later, a thin man with cold, dead eyes emerged from the canyon. It was Garrett Wells himself. "Mr. Ward," Wells said with a smile that never came close to reaching his eyes. "Funny thing, I had some men tell me about you just yesterday. Said you were real interested in our merchandise." Silas's blood turned to ice in his veins. They knew. Somehow they knew exactly who he was and what he had done. "Not sure what you mean," Silas said carefully, his hand hovering near his own pistol. "Oh, I think you do," Wells said, his smile widening into a predatory grin. He gave a subtle signal to his men, and suddenly, more rifles were pointed at Silas from the rocks above. "See, we've been missing a rather valuable piece of property. An Apache boy, about 12 years old. My men tracked him right to your ranch." The trap was closing, but Silas forced himself to remain calm, to play the part. "Can't say I know anything about that." "Really?" Wells reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a familiar, crumpled piece of paper, the bill of sale that Dakota had been carrying. "My men found this in your saddlebags when they searched them a few minutes ago." Silas's heart sank. They'd searched his belongings while he was distracted by the guards. He had been a fool. An amateur walking into a den of professionals. "Of course, we also found these," Wells continued, producing the bag of silver coins that Silas had brought to make his disguise convincing. Real generous of you, bringing payment for the boy's return." "Where are the children?" Silas asked, abandoning all pretense, his voice hard and cold. "Safe and sound, for now." Wells gestured vaguely toward the back of the canyon. 22 of them, anyway. The one you stole is going to cost you extra." 22. Dakota was safe with his father, but 22 other souls were still trapped in this hell. Children who had been torn from their families, waiting in terror to be sold to the highest bidder. "What do you want?" Silas asked, knowing the answer would be something terrible. "It's a simple trade, Mr. Ward," Wells said, his voice dripping with mock pleasantry. "You for them. See, it turns out you're worth a whole lot more to me than all those kids combined." "I don't understand." Wells laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Your new Apache friends are real fond of you from what my scout reports. They're willing to risk their lives, their warriors, to help you rescue these children. That kind of loyalty, Mr. Ward, that makes you a very valuable piece of bait." The horrifying truth hit Silas like a physical blow. Wells wasn't just going to kill him. He was going to use him. Use him to draw Nailish and his warriors into a perfectly laid trap. The Apache would come to rescue him, walking straight into a prepared ambush that would slaughter them. "They won't come," Silas said desperately, trying to find some way, any way, to stop it. "Oh, they'll come," Wells said with absolute certainty, "because that little Apache boy of yours is going to tell his daddy exactly where you are. And the Apache, Mr. Ward, they don't leave debts unpaid." Wells was right. Nailish would honor their agreement. He would attempt a rescue, never knowing that he was leading his people to their deaths. As the guards tied Silas's hands behind his back, he caught a glimpse of the children's prison. It was a makeshift corral, surrounded by high wooden walls, and through the small gaps in the planks, he could see small, terrified faces peering out, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. But the rescue that was coming wasn't going to save anyone. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and blood red, Silas sat bound in the center of the camp. He was positioned perfectly, a solitary figure tied to a post, exactly where Nailish and his warriors would see him when they arrived. Wells had positioned 15 men around the canyon rim and in the rocks below, more than double the number that Dakota had reported. They had called in reinforcements. They hadn't just set a trap, they had prepared for a massacre. But Garrett Wells had made one crucial, fatal mistake. He assumed that the Apache warriors would behave like he would. He assumed they would charge in recklessly, driven by emotion, to save their new white ally. The first sign that his assumption was deadly wrong came as the shadows began to lengthen across the canyon floor. Instead of the expected war cries and the thunder of hooves, there was only a profound, unnatural silence. "Where are they?" one of the guards whispered nervously from his perch on the rocks, the silence stretching his nerves to the breaking point. Wells checked his pocket watch, a flicker of annoyance on his face. "They'll come," he muttered, more to himself than to his man. "Apache honor demands it." But Nailish was a leader who had spent 30 long years surviving the brutal conflicts of the frontier. He didn't charge headfirst into obvious traps. The attack, when it finally came, was nothing like Wells had expected. It began with the guards on the canyon rim simply disappearing. There were no shots fired, no sounds of a struggle, no cries of alarm. One moment, a man was there, silhouetted against the dying light. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. "Morrison! Stevens!" Wells called out toward the ridge, a note of unease creeping into his voice. There was no answer, only the whisper of the wind through the canyon. That's when Silas understood. While Wells had been focused on the main entrance, on his perfectly laid ambush, Nailish's warriors had scaled the sheer canyon walls under the cover of the deepening darkness. They were moving like ghosts, silent and invisible, systematically and silently eliminating the outer guards one by one. Suddenly, a rope dropped from the darkness above, landing precisely where Silas sat. Before he could even react, the rope was pulled taut, and he was hauled upward, up and out of the camp, in one swift, fluid motion. He was free before Wells even realized what was happening. "Find them!" Wells screamed, his voice raw with fury and disbelief. But his remaining men were already under attack. Apache warriors seemed to materialize from every shadow, their assault perfectly coordinated and devastatingly effective. But they weren't trying to kill everyone. They were hurting them, driving the remaining guards away from the children's corral with a disciplined, strategic violence. Silas, cut free by Dakota himself, who had insisted on joining the rescue, ran toward the makeshift prison. The children inside were pressed against the walls in terror, too frightened to understand that they were being rescued. "It's all right," Silas called out in English, and then in the few Apache words Dakota had taught him. "You're going home." The corral gate was secured with heavy iron chains and a thick padlock. As Silas struggled with the stubborn locks, desperate to break them, he heard frantic footsteps behind him. He spun around to see Wells, blood streaming from a wound on his head, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. He had a pistol in his hand, and it was trained squarely on Silas. You cost me everything," Wells snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a small, smooth stone struck his gun hand with incredible force and accuracy. Dakota stood 20 feet away, already loading another stone into his simple leather sling, a skill he had honed to perfection during his 7 months of captivity. The pistol went flying through the air. In the next instant, Nailish appeared from the shadows like an avenging spirit to end Wells's threat, and his despicable trade in human lives, permanently. "The children," Silas gasped, turning back to the gate and finally managing to break the last of the chains. What followed was a scene of controlled chaos. 22 children, ranging in age from 8 to 15, stumbled out of their prison, blinking in the moonlight, their faces a mixture of disbelief, fear, and dawning hope. The Apache children ran into the arms of the waiting warriors, but there were also Mexican and white children who stood alone, lost and bewildered, with no one to run to. "What happens to them?" Silas asked Nailish, gesturing to the non-Apache children who huddled together for comfort. "They come with us," Nailish said simply, without a moment's hesitation. "Until their families can be found, they are our children now." As a new dawn broke over the canyon, the rescue was complete. Every child was accounted for. The guards were either dead or had scattered to the 4 winds, and the slavers' camp was being reduced to ashes. But the real shock, the real miracle, came when they returned to the Apache territory. Word of the joint rescue had spread like a wildfire on the plains, and something unprecedented, something truly unbelievable, was happening. White settlers from 3 different ranches had ridden to the edge of the Apache lands, but they hadn't come with weapons drawn. They had come with offers of help. They were families who had lost their own children to slavers years ago, traders who had heard the dark rumors of missing kids, all of them, drawn by this incredible story, wanting to assist in any way they could, to help reunite the rescued children with their long-lost families. "This is not the end," Nailish told Silas, as they stood together, watching Apache and settler families working together, trying to comfort the traumatized children. "This is how it begins." Silas looked over at Dakota, who was patiently teaching another young Apache boy a few words of English, while at the same time learning Spanish from a rescued Mexican girl. The young rancher had started the day by accidentally shooting an Apache boy, but what he did next had shocked everyone, including himself. He had proven that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can create the most powerful and lasting change. If you enjoyed this story, Click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.